Hello, one and all, and welcome back to our RimWorld Restart Undead series. My friends, I'm ever so glad to see you back here with me once more today. As you well know, in the last few episodes, we've been making some extensive expansions into not only our base, but our research as well, and that is currently what we're beginning with today. One such project that we've been working on since the last episode that we recently finished is mortars, now allowing us not only to create mortars themselves, but the shells, which is really what we were going for. For the sheer sake of defensive purposes, we're going to begin working on trench warfare for our next project, as it unlocks a smorgasbord of different things like barbed wire, decoy targets, yada yada yada. In the meantime, we're also going to be collecting resources, in particular plasteel, which is something that we need for our skip ship, and which is something that we don't currently have a lot of. It was during this time that we easily ended up finishing our research into trench warfare, and shortly thereafter, the shuttle had finally arrived to take on Carrie, our Dwarven friend who's been hanging out with us for quite a while now. Anyhow, though, we loaded her up into the shuttle and sent her on her merry way. Our new Dwarven friends made good on their promise to deliver after we sent her back home, giving us an Archotech eye as well as a few advanced components. We wasted absolutely no time operating on Laz to give him a brand new right eye, and thankfully the surgery went down perfectly. Now Laz could take off his eye patch, though I did notice it seemed like it was over his left eye while his right eye was the one that needed to be replaced. Not really sure how that happened. Whoopsie. Either way, though, he could see perfectly now. Actually, more so than before. His sight was now increased to 138%. We are still currently working on our project of sculptures at the moment as well, making quite the little stockpile, that way we could sell them, which we would actually begin to do by loading them up into Big Boss, our van. However, this was interrupted. It would seem that space and time itself has ripped wide open, and there are many water elementals coming out to try and slaughter us. We would all very quickly run to mount to our defenses as well as to our crocodile tank. As you could imagine, the water elementals were quite resistant to our flamethrower, unfortunately, although we would continue attempting to run them over, even with us being in their element of a little pond. Thankfully, we would end up winning this fight, but the substantial damage that was done to the crocodile would render it immobile for the moment. Quite a shame, as we now had many more elementals coming right for us, some of them extremely large in their stature. Nonetheless, if it can bleed, even if it is bleeding water, then it can die. Even with our frequent use of firearms, I also thought it might be useful to use Loinchin's magical abilities by summoning a lightning totem to help us out. And I'm quite glad I did as well. If nothing else, the chain lightning definitely weakened them enough that it was quite easy for us to finish off the remaining elementals. And with that, my friends, we have finally defeated the rift itself as it has closed, leaving behind a few gems, some jade, and unrefined magicite. Magicite can be quite useful for scrolls and spells, things of a magical nature, if you will. Not only did the rift leave them behind, but we could also get them by butchering the elementals themselves. It can also be sold for a pretty decent price, which is most likely what we'll do with it. Speaking of which, we're going to finish loading all of our sculptures up into the van, along with unrefined magicite and quite a few other items to go out on a bit of a trade mission. The idea is to travel to a nearby Dwarven settlement where we can go about selling all these items. Now, of course, we communicated with them ahead of time to let them know that our caravan was coming, at which point they actually had a special trade request for us in the near future, as we're already on our way there right now. It would seem that they have quite a few horses that need some proper armor, and in exchange they'll give us a recon eye, a skill trainer, another book, as well as a lot of plasteel, which we were very much interested in. We would immediately begin mining out some of the last few steel reserves in our area here. That way we could begin utilizing this steel to make the horse armor for them. Though, since Noskov is the only one that's capable of creating this armor at the quality that's required by the dwarves, it is going to take quite a bit of time to go about producing it. Luckily, though, in the meantime, we were having quite a few chats with Kona Yoshimaru, and we even managed to convince her to join us here. She still seems to think that she's some type of special warrior leader from another dimension, and that she already knows Laz from a past past life or some dumb shit like that, but what's most important to us is her loyalty. And that does indeed seem to be something that she has in droves for Laz already. Now, as I briefly touched on a little bit earlier in the episode, we're currently collecting a bunch of resources for our very first skip ship, but before we do that and actually build it, we're going to need to build a proper landing pad for it as well. Now, with that completed, we were finally ready and prepared to go about building the ship itself, especially after Laz had returned home with enough gold and plasteel to do so. We had to do quite a bit of trading for this little bad boy, and it also basically cost us our entire reserve of silver, but it will be worth it, trust me. This ship and the many more that I hope to have following it shall be crucial for the revolution and for our movement. It wasn't too long after we built the ship, though, that we ended up recruiting Nivorlus, the elven sorceress who attacked us last episode with some undead, who also opened up the pit gate that ripped through dimensions according to Kona Yoshimaru. But nevertheless, this sorceress is indeed a true necromancer, which is going to be quite useful for us because that does mean that we can use her magical prowess and abilities to raise corpses from the dead, and thus adding them onto our army and revolution itself. Late one evening, we let her go out and choose the corpses that she'd like to reanimate. Shocking to no one, she ended up choosing her fellow elves. She had collected 4, but only had enough mana to raise 3 from the dead, as this is very taxing on her all the time. 2 of them even appeared to be from her personal guard, while the other seems to have been maybe one of the cultist elves or someone who we had killed a year or so ago. I could tell because her guard here on the left was in much better condition than the cultist on the right, being a complete skeleton by this point. One of the downsides to having the undead be risen, as you might see and might imagine, is that they are incredibly slow, not only at their work speed, but also just moving in general. We can alleviate this issue just a little bit as we continue improving our necromancer skill, and thus we can hasten the undead just a little bit, but they'll never quite be as fast as they would be if they were alive. Now, even so though, they are able to do normal tasks just as any other colonist, which is absolutely wonderful. Though their speed is nerfed, since they are undead, they don't have to eat or sleep or anything like that, and they're just essentially a 24/7 workforce. Extremely useful, especially when it's late at night and we need a machining table built or things of that sort. Speaking of which, with our new machining table, we're actually going to begin producing some proper mortar shells that we can use in our skip. Before we move on though, as we were making these mortar shells, our necromancer sorceress ended up falling for Laz. Laz, the silver-tongued devil that he is, was playfully making fun of her judgment and how she tore a rift in between realities and almost killed all of us. And now they're in love. How sweet. Ah yes, from enemies to lovers. I will say things have escalated quite quickly. She was trying to kill us and now they're in love, and also their first night together, she's pregnant. Yeah, I told you things were escalating very quickly. It seems that Laz and she are going to be mommy and daddy now. I suppose a congratulations is in order for our father-to-be. In other good news, we finally finished up all that horse armor that we were working on, so we were going to load it up into our skip to take it out for the delivery. It only seemed fitting that Laz would be the one to take the skip out on its maiden voyage. Be careful up there, old pal. You've got a lot to lose down here. We would end up arriving rather quickly, as one might imagine, and thus we began to fulfill our trade agreement. Returning home with many of the items discussed, most importantly our plasteel, though I must say with the plasteel it's really only giving us a head start on our next skip since we already built this one. Now then, one of the eyes that we ended up getting as a reward is a recon eye, which is actually quite a bit better than an Archotech eye, and it would be perfect for someone of Noskov's caliber. Plus I think it looks really badass with her other red eye. But anyhow though, not only would we give her a recon eye, but we would also give her Lockwood's charge lance. For you see, with this eye and this weapon, she is going to be our sniper, not to mention that that she has a light passion for shooting as well as a 13 in the skill. I would say she's pretty overqualified for the position. Speaking of which, we would also have our undead elves go and equip some of their elven halberds that they were using while alive, along with any firearms that we had left. Now, we had plenty of weapons, but we were severely lacking in the armor department, so I began loading all of our sculptures that we've been making again back up into the skip, and we would actually go out and do some trading with the elves and the orcs once more. We also done some trading with the dwarves, who we knew were a bit more technologically advanced, and by the time we made it back home, we ended up having 2 new helmets of not so great quality. Nevertheless, these brain buckets would do a pretty good job at protecting our skulls, better than our natural organic defenses, i.e. our bones, I suppose, so we ended up giving them to Noskov and Loinchen, who were lacking helmets. They wouldn't stop a bullet, but perhaps if somebody chucked a rock at our head, we'd be completely fine. Though I fear our enemy for today may not be throwing rocks, as we have a small RimWorld state outpost not too far from the base. It's not very large and is most likely some type of safe house, or it's something of that sort, which would be the perfect target for us to test out our bombing runs with the skip. We would go ahead and send out a caravan to attack, comprised of the crocodile, Frostfang, our horses, the big boss van, and anything and everything in between, everyone except for Laz. For you see, Laz will be staying back home and loading up mortar shells into the skip, hopping in and readying himself for battle. Not only to test the bombing, but because this is the safest place for him. I often like to put him in quite the bind just to keep things interesting, but not today, at least not for the moment. No, as for right now, this little outpost shall be attacked by everyone else as Laz is flying overhead. I did spot a familiar face at the outpost, however. It would seem the same officer that led the merciless assault against the orcs in the beginning of last episode is here as well. I believe that this very well may be where she stays in her spare time, as to not draw too much attention. She's even adorned her gibbeck cages all around the outpost with the corpses of orcs. How disgusting. We were completely outraged by this, but we couldn't rush in so sloppily just yet. We would call in the signal for Laz back home, and so began our bombing runs. We had only managed to kill one of their soldiers, but we also took out one of their mini turrets and injured the officer quite well. With their soldiers dying, the coward would attempt to try to run away, which we just couldn't let happen. A shootout began in the alleyway, and the officer wouldn't make it out of there alive. Even though it would seem that our bombing runs need a little bit of practice, they did do some crucial damage, giving us the upper hand and winning us the day. Plus, imagine having 3 or 4 more of those skips with much larger bombs. There would be no outpost left. Speaking of which, we began going throughout the area, building to building, looking for any useful items. We ended up finding 7 vials of metal blood serum, which will come in very handy for any upcoming raids that attack us or any that we end up doing. We were also lucky enough to uninstall a fire foam popper and a turret. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing, I suppose, and they'll both come in quite handy back home. Speaking of which, we made the journey back home, where Laz was already waiting on us, and as we began to pull in our big boss and crocodile, he greeted us in the garage. Everyone congratulating each other on a successful mission, a job well done. And now that we're finally back home, I decided that we would begin partaking in a bit of an expansion and construction project onto our base. As you heard me mention earlier, imagine if we had 3 or 4 of these skips, right? Well, we need a proper place to park them all, and thus just on the outside of our armory, we ended up building what I suppose we could refer to as a hangar bay, something of another open courtyard, but this time around where we can actually park our ship along with any future ships we end up building. We had also built something of a small corridor that led outside into this hangar bay as well, so I decided that we would shift our power generators up there. It felt like a very fitting place. In the days to come, though, Laz ended up proposing marriage to Nivorlus, and the two of them are are now engaged. Moving awful fast, but I suppose that's what happens when you get pregnant the same night you start dating. Anywho, we threw down a marriage spot in our recreation room, and we're going to start making some improvements in there so it's nice and ready for the wedding ceremony. We would also take a hot moment to begin installing some of the things that we got from the Outpost, like the fire foam popper, but also the mini turret that we took as well. We would actually make some additions to the area that the mini turret's at by putting sandbags around it and just kind of walling off our corpse pile. This may not seem like a big deal, but we have a real problem right now where our soldiers will walk through this area, see the decomposing corpses, and get a substantial mood debuff. Because of our ever-growing population, I thought it might be a good idea for us to go ahead and begin at least planting yet another field of rice. As you might have noticed earlier, we had to begin doing some hunting because our food baskets were empty. Thankfully, all this planting was easily carried out around the clock by our undead companions, and just as well, they would also be able to work around the clock on making some car parts for us. Because of the fact they didn't have to sleep or eat, and we didn't have to worry about them having a mental break, we could easily make all of these parts very quickly, thus allowing us to build our very first actual tank that isn't a flamethrower tank within a very short period of time. This, my friends, is a roadkill tank, and for it to be a tank, it is indeed quite small, and it can only hold one soldier at a time to operate it, but it packs one hell of a punch. And I truly think that this little murderous machine, as well as a few others that we can build, will be crucial for taking down the state government. And of course, if you guys are interested, we do need a name for this little beauty, so be sure to leave those in the comments section if you would like. We would once again have Roy begin making plenty of wooden sculptures for us, but this time around we're actually not going to be selling them. No, we're actually going to be decorating all of our rooms with them to make them much nicer. Because of the less than desirable conditions here on this icy cold planet, we have mental breaks pretty often, unfortunately, so this should help counteract that. There's also something new about a RimWorld of Magic. Although I don't believe it's actually new, I think it's just new to me. It's the fact that we can make golems. So I decided to try to make one, and I ended up with a straw golem. However, even after implanting it with some type of energy cell or something of that nature, it still didn't seem to come to life. After further inspection, it appears that we need a Golemancer, which is a special type of magical class, which makes sense. Sorry I wasted your time. Could be something fun for the future though, like an army of the undead and golems perhaps. Speaking of which, we were able to increase our sorceress's abilities as a necromancer with powered creation, allowing her to raise more corpses from the dead. We allowed her to pick out 2 more corpses, which just so happened to once again be some elves. I'm sure it helps out with coordination that they can all speak the elven language even in their decaying undead state. Plus, they're the only corpses that are still recognizable from our pile, so with this we ended up having quite the little squadron to protect us, but not only that, to work around our base and to help us with our revolution, of course. Nivorlus and Laz's baby is going to be the most well-protected child on this whole damn planet, I'd say. Speaking of protection, our skip ship is pretty great at doing bombings, but I thought it might also be quite useful for us to have some proper mortars in place around the base itself in our courtyard with our solar panels. This way, when attacks happen on our home as we're flying over to drop mortar shells on top of them, we can also end up firing them at them as well at the exact same time, completely overwhelming them, or at least that's the idea, hopefully. For quite a bit of time, I just let everyone kind of do their day-to-day operations, growing food for everyone inside the base, of course, working on sculptures and things like that, basically just getting our inventory up. This was interrupted, however, when I noticed that our kitty cat here was in a state of confusion. This appears to have been brought on by dementia, which she must have had when we first got her, because I never noticed her developing it at all. She's only 10 years old, so this is a little surprising. Our poor little baby. Even if she begins to forget who we are at times, we shall never forget the love we share with her. Speaking of love and medical conditions, Nivorlus is about to give birth. Yes, indeed, she is now in labor. We would all very quickly gather up into the operating room to prepare for the birth of her and Laz's child, with Kona Yoshimaru as our doctor. Even if Laz doesn't realize it, and even if this may not even be the same Laz that Kona Yoshimaru knew, This is the greatest honor of her life, to deliver his child, and after several hours of agonizing labor, we had a healthy baby boy. Though excruciatingly painful, as with most births, everyone was a-okay, thankfully, and our revolution just got a little bit larger. Now that the two of them have a proper family that is growing a little bit bigger than what our normal bedrooms are like, I decided to build them an extra large one on the opposite side of the base. For protective purposes, I decided to double wall it, with the outer wall being granite and the inner wall being a fine wood, mostly for looks. And just large enough for a family of 3, 2 adults and 1 baby. Sometimes I often wonder in this series if every time we start a new episode, we're going to have to start the series over because Laz is going to die, and I wonder what'll happen to our revolution, and to all the people that we've met along the way. But with the way everything's been going, I think everything and everyone is going to be a-okay. Spoke too soon, it would seem.